Okay, moving on to the division and the separation of powers. This is so much more tricky than it needs to be. We learn about both of these in the preliminary course, but one is significantly more relevant than the other when it comes to the HSC course. I'll explain the division of powers and then we can pretty well ignore it. The division of powers is the basis of federation, where they had to differentiate between the federal and the state governments and what their powers would be. From the top level, we have the head of state, which takes care of things like our currency, because that's the same across all the states. The next level down is we have the concurrent powers, where they both work together, the state and federal government, on things like taxation and divorce. Then we have the residual powers. So the residue of that takes us down to the state level, where we take care of things like education, health, housing, transport, and so forth. We learn about this in preliminary, and so often I've seen it in multiple choice questions as an option instead of the separation of powers, so people get confused. As much as you can, division of powers, away. Instead, we look at the separation of powers, which is really important for protecting human rights, because it means that we have different levels that someone would hypothetically have to move through if they were a dictatorship trying to change the way Australian society works. We have the legislature arm, first of all, and they are Parliament's lawmakers. So they're the people in Parliament who are changing laws like we have in New South Wales, the lockout laws created under the Mike Baird Parliament. So that's there. Second of all, we have the executive powers, which are the government's ministers and its body. So we have the Minister for Health, the Minister for Home Affairs, and so forth. So they take a different kind of approach. They have a different prerogative. And the other section we have is the judicial discretion awarded at the bottom there. So the judicial element of the separation of powers. There can be tension here again. This is about the judges and their ability in court to protect human rights. Of course, this comes into conflict when we have mandatory sentencing, which is created by the legislature arm. They bring in mandatory sentencing and take away discretion and power and responsibility from the judicial arm of the separation of powers. So although all of these can work together and should work harmoniously, there are tensions at times as well. But the reason we have it is to protect our human rights, to make sure the power isn't concentrated in one spot. Again, ignore the division of powers. The separation of powers is what you'll need in a multiple choice question, for example, where it's asking you between the two, or if you're explaining it in relation to human rights in a short answer. Thank you for listening.